So it's very similar sometimes to working and hanging out with like middle schoolers. It's just squirrely and weird, and you're not quite sure what's going to happen.
Oh no! Disaster! What a bad idea!
Welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast with your host, Troy Wallace, a podcast for human resources information systems professionals to help you elevate your HRIS career. We always say no one gets into HRIS on purpose, but it sure is interesting to find out how they did. We interview your HRIS peers to find out how they got tricked into the industry and what lessons and tools they use to progress their careers along the way. We discuss industry trends, AI, and even talk candidly about all the most popular HRIS platforms. Just think of it as the closest bar just outside the entrance of your favorite HR technology conference. Now you get it. Welcome in. Welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast, broadcasting as usual from the beautiful studios in downtown Omaha, Nebraska. You might be able to hear it in my voice. I'm going to call this the trying to get rid of the spring cold episode. Hey, we've got a really great guest today. Our guest is Lisa-Maree Blumenfeld. One of the side benefits of doing this podcast is you get to meet really nice people. She has founded a company called RetainHR. You can find it at RetainHR.com. They do fractional HR. We'll talk a little bit about what that is if you're not familiar with the concept. Someone from her team reached out to the podcast, and this just ended up being a really great fit. So we don't often talk about challenges for HRIS and payroll for small business and startup businesses. And I feel like Lisa-Maree was a great person to talk to that. And just overall, Lisa was an absolute delight to speak with. So Lisa founded RetainHR nearly 9 years ago, but prior to that, she was the VP of People at Expa. She led a centralized HR and recruiting team that worked on behalf of 20-plus startups, so she had a ton of experience in that world and continues that work with RetainHR. Also worked through much larger companies, had some involvement with Lyft, Ninth Decimal, ARIA Systems, larger Fortune 500 companies such as PG&E, Blue Shield of California. We're going to get deep into fractional HR, challenges for startups and small businesses as it relates to HRIS. We actually may name names, talk about a couple of vendors in that space. We geek out about Pearl Jam and 90s Gen X music. Just a really fun conversation. You can really feel her enthusiasm for startups, middle stage companies. She's right in the heart of it there in the Bay Area. And as if she doesn't have enough going on, she has also co-founded I'll call it performance management company called 11. You can check them out at get11app.com. And they're trying to solve the problems of having more meaningful one-on-one meetings. And we get into that during the podcast as well. Again, without further ado, let's get into it with our guest, Lisa-Maree Blumenfeld of RetainHR. Lisa-Maree Blumenfeld, welcome to HRIS Careers. We certainly appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. I think we had some people connect us in some way. And I'm always looking for interesting podcast guests. And I felt like you had a very distinct career path.
Okay.
And also, I think you can enlighten us on some things in the HRIS world for smaller companies.
Sure.
And I will have done your introduction already.
Okay.
But do you mind, number one, just can be high level. We always are real curious about how people got into HR in the first place. And I have listened to some of your podcasts. I know yours is pretty interesting, not the traditional path.
Yeah.
And if we could go like high level on that,
Sure.
and then we're going to get into how you started your company, RetainHR.
Okay. Yeah, I wish, Troy, I could say that my career path was like something that was super well thought out. And that's the same answer I would give for your first question too. But no, in college, I ended up with a degree in religious studies, which is very different. Just loved the historical research of all of it. And so did that. And then shortly after college, I was recruited to be a recruiter, which I didn't really even know that recruiting and HR was a job. But I got into recruiting and loved it. I'd, done a lot of competitive sports growing up. And so the competitive nature of recruiting was really fun, but I also loved building those relationships and getting to know people and what they were looking for, and then helping them find their next role. So loved it, did it for years. But I think the thing that was missing for me is, you spend all this time building these relationships and you get them, hopefully their, dream job. And then they just kind of go away and then you start over again. And so it became very transactional. And that's when I learned more about HR, about how that role, you're able to kind of usher them through their entire life cycle with a company. And so I knew I wanted to do that. I wanted to continue on in these relationships. And so was able to get into the HR side of things and I just loved the whole process. So again, not like a well thought out path, but it's works for me.
Well, you may not know this. People that listen to the podcast regularly do, is we kind of joke, but it's not a joke, that we say, HRIS. No one gets here on purpose.
No, that's exactly, that is so true. I only know a few people who got their degree in HR. And I'm like, how did you even know that was a thing in college? And coincidentally, those of my friends that have an HR degree decided right after college that is absolutely not what they wanted to do. So it's just the flip-flop situation.
Oh, it's absolutely. I went to school and my college roommate was going to go to law school and I thought that's what I wanted to do.
Oh, wow.
And so I've just said, well, I'll get whatever degree you're getting. And then there's these things called, what are they called? Grades?
Oh, weird.
That really got in the way of me going to law school.
Oh, sure.
I was, I had to figure out what was the other thing I could go into. And it just so happened he was working at a hotel and the head of human resources person had the same degree we did. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess maybe that's what I'll do. I got to pay back the student loans. But yep, you're in good company.
Perfect.
Nobody gets here on purpose.
I love it.
So you really took it far because, we won't go into the detail because you worked for some really big companies and I'll have that in your bio. I'm really curious about how you got the idea or where you saw the need to start a company for kind of fractional HR, I'll call it, with RetainHR.
Yeah. Like you said, I've had the great opportunity to work in some really big companies. I've also worked in some really fun startups. But right before starting Retain, I had the opportunity to work in an accelerator. And so, what we were doing was building the infrastructure for all of these, really, in some cases, just ideas. The partners would have an idea for a new company. And so we would come in kind of like a SWAT team and build that infrastructure. And I was in charge of all of HR and recruiting for all of these companies. And so I was already kind of doing this fractional work. I was working with 20 or 30 different startups, anywhere between 0 employees to call it, 15 before they would kind of stuff out on their own. And so I knew that I loved that. And it was just this really exciting place where I was constantly context shifting and jumping from one product to another and different founding teams. And it was just a perfect chaos for me. And so when they changed their model and they were no longer offering that same type of service, I knew that I could either go back in-house with a company and run HR again, or maybe there was this market for this more broadly. And so decided to test it out a little. And that was almost 9 years ago.
Oh,
yeah.
That is good. Can I take you back a half step?
Yeah.
Because I really always get curious and I've been listening to Tim Ferriss' podcast for too many years, and he always gets into the real nitty gritty detail. So when you went to work for this company, where you started doing that, when you went to work for that company, was this the position you thought you were entering, or was it a more general HR job?
No, I definitely knew that was what the job was.
Okay.
And I was really excited about it. I loved the concept of working very closely with founders. And I knew that from my experience in working in really big companies and also a few different startups, that for me, where I felt the most excitement and where I could contribute in really meaningful ways was these like really small startups. I just loved it so much. And so when I was recruited to do this, it was, again, kind of something that I didn't know existed. Obviously, incubators and accelerators existed, but I didn't realize that there was a role for someone like me to do all of the HR and recruiting for all these companies. So it was a really great place to go and learn how to do it. And I was the first one to do it. So I was kind of making it up as I went. And all of that is always so fun for me to do.
Yeah, I always thought that, and that's probably why I've stayed more on the consulting side rather than working for one company, is I love to see how different businesses operate.
Yep.
Right? There's always like the little puzzles. There's some similarities, but there's enough different that you're always learning.
Right.
So let's take a step forward.
Okay.
So a lot of the people that are in the audience are HRIS people. If there are dedicated HRIS people at a company, that means they're probably over 300, 500, thousands of employees. So maybe not everybody's familiar with kind of fractional HR services.
Right.
Can you talk about the types of companies that are maybe your perfect customer or the ones where you find that you provide the most value?
Yeah, I would say that Retain is normally brought in to companies with anywhere between like 15 and 20 employees. That's usually like the smallest. We had one that was 2 employees, but it was like a serial founder that I had worked with that had learned that getting HR early is beneficial. And then, we work with companies sometimes for years through a lot of different changes. But I would say that generally we can run alongside a company and own and manage the HR function, sometimes between like 100 and 150 employees, at which time we'll say like, hey, you probably need a full-time person, and we'll help them find that person and bring them in and have a seamless transition. In some of those cases, we've hired HR people, we hire a VP of HR and they're running the function. And then, a couple of years later, they give notice and the company has brought us back in to oversee the department again while they look for someone else. We've also come in to cover people in HR while they've been on maternity leave or, any situation like that. And in some cases, we've gone into really like bigger companies to do a project or to be a complete third party to handle like an investigation. So there's a variety of things that we can do, but I would say that the majority of our work is companies that are, call it 20 to 100, 150 employees.
Got it. So do you supply professional employer organization type activities? Is that one of your offerings, or is it more you need the HR need, we'll come in, we'll plug ourselves into your current infrastructure and we'll run with that? Or can you kind of come with a full stack, including like PEO?
Yeah, we can do the full thing. It just really depends on what the company needs. So we have some companies, if we're talking HRIS, right? We have some companies that are full PEO, but we would oftentimes do the evaluation of what does the company need? What systems are out there? What would be the most ideal for the company, and kind of run them through that process and handle the implementation, the employee training, making sure that it's running smoothly. So that on the HRIS side is kind of where we play. But then we're doing like performance reviews and, things that the HRIS system, they're not going to get involved on an employee basis in that way. Layoffs or handling the hiring and negotiation and all of that stuff is stuff that we would do that like a PEO wouldn't necessarily do on a like individual basis like that.
All right. So you open the door.
Yes.
For me to ask these questions. Okay. So if it's too nerdy, we can cut it out.
Nerdy.
Yeah. So when you come in, I'll give you a for instance. It's a 30-person company. You're coming in. They said we're growing too quickly. We don't have any infrastructure. Yeah. You help us choose not only HR policy and those types of things, but the HRIS and payroll systems, do you have a go-to stack that you currently like to use for smaller employers? And if you're willing to name names, fantastic. I don't, at some point I do want sponsors, but I'm okay. If you've had, bad experiences, we can talk about that. But
yeah,
what does that look like for maybe a new client that comes in that needs those services?
Yeah, I think for companies that we've worked with, and it's interesting to kind of bring this into the mixer here, but I would say that the needs they changed a bit during COVID, right? So prior to COVID, we weren't doing a lot with PEOs. Even though you would think that small startups would lean that way, I think just the expense of PEOs was too much. And so they wanted to keep a lot of that in-house.
Right.
So we work very frequently with companies like Gusto.
Okay.
So again, not a PEO. The company is responsible for their own policies and handbooks and all of that, but it's a great tech stack, if you will, for self-service and onboarding and payroll and things like that. So that's a great option for a small company. We work with that a lot, but we would do that evaluation. So generally coming into a company, like you said, for instance, it would be kind of doing an audit of where are things now? What is your headcount plan? What is your funding plan? What are going to be the needs of this HRIS? Because putting a company on Gusto that's going to get to 300 people in 2 years is not going to scale as well. So let's really think about the future needs, because switching out an HRIS can be a pain.
Oh no! Disaster! What a bad idea!
And we do that too. But even just from the employee perspective, it's just complicated. So we want to pick something that'll last for the company for a while. PEOs we work with quite frequently, especially during and post-COVID. We had more companies want to shift to that because we had a number of employees that said, well, if I don't have to be on site in San Francisco, I'm going to move to Montana or whatever.
Right.
And the companies weren't registered in those states. We started to run into big issues with benefit not covering. So,
right.
For instance, if you had a startup in San Francisco that had Kaiser and one employee moved to Montana, well, there's no Kaiser in Montana. So be able to go to a PEO to have all of that covered was really helpful. And so companies at that time were willing to take on the extra cost for the convenience of having people in all these different locations.
Right. And would a Gusto, and I'm familiar with them because I keep a list of all of the vendors in general. And by the way, Gusto, this was not a paid endorsement, but it could be. It could be, right? Can Gusto handle the benefits piece as well?
Yeah.
As for not only enrollment, because a lot of systems can do that now, but also the brokering and the actual procurement of the insurance and all of those pieces, or is that things that you end up doing?
No, Gusto will do that. And so they, through their system, they'll take a look at what the employee base is. And we'll work with them through a survey. And we also have a benefits support person prior to open enrollment that will help them identify the needs. And then they'll come up with here's 3 options for you to look through, right? And here's kind of the, all of the different information, and you can compare prices and whatever. And then for me, what I would do is the evaluation of those. And if any one of those work, then great. And if not, I would ask them to kind of reshuffle the deck and find us something more appropriate. But if there is a carrier or carriers that would work, then we kind of take it from there. But it all goes within their system. So when someone is doing open enrollment, it's all doing that. And they're the midpoint between the employee and employer and the carriers as a broker.
Got it. So for the most part, they can be a one-stop shop. Do you find that, I'm just going to keep making this one step more complicated
I love
for
it.
So let's say that same 30-person company,
Yeah.
they've got 10 people, 3 in California, 2 in Texas, the rest scattered in the United States. The other 20, they've got 4 in Estonia
Okay.
and 2 in Mexico.
Yeah.
Is it still a gusto, or are you finding that there's someone better to help with that kind of either employer of record situation or international?
The international obviously adds a lot of complexity. If for nothing else, well, not if for nothing. I mean, employment law is different. The benefit systems, I mean, a lot of other countries have governmental benefits. So the benefits that we supply are not applicable. So no, Gusto would work for those companies, but you would have the other, the employees that are international go payrolled through like an agency, usually like a deal or something like that. Or, you could consider them an independent contractor if that's a route that was appropriate based off of the laws of that area. So Gusto wouldn't manage international employees like that.
Right. And I'm finding, I went to the HR technology conference this last September, and you meet lots of people and different things.
Wow.
Highly recommend it if you're in the industry. But it appears to me that the deals of the world are getting themselves embedded. They're saying, okay, Gusto, okay, hi, Bob.
Right.
Let us be that arm of your product and kind of white label.
Yeah, I've started to see them be, to your point, more white labeled. It's not across the board yet, but yes, those are either white labeled or they are an integration that you can have. So if you pull a report, it can pull like the deal report as well as Gusto to have a more comprehensive compensation report. So there's ways to do some of that with a lot of these systems, but I generally lean on the side of keeping them fairly separate, if you can, just because, again, the employee laws are so different, and having a company that is U.S. focused, kind of dabble in some of these other country laws is not going to protect the companies so much. So I like to keep it fairly separate if possible.
Yes, I just had a situation like that myself with one of my clients, and yes, they're not good at it.
No, they're not.
They're never good at it.
They're
If they try and go outside their home country. All right, so I know we have limited time with you, so I want to get into this right away. So I know you've started a second company, or at least maybe with some partners, called 11. And I loved, so I think I mentioned, I listened to some other podcasts that you were on, and I loved the genesis of this idea. Could you go into a little bit of detail of what made you start 11 and how you think it's helping companies?
Sure. Yeah. So there's 4 co-founders on this, and one of the other co-founders, Thomas, he is an executive coach. And so he was working with a lot of founders and leaders and figuring out that there has been this breakdown in communication, at least intentional, meaningful communication between leaders and employees. And like I was noticing it on through a different lens where we were doing a ton of exit interviews and learning that people were leaving their companies, not necessarily because they were recruited out or whatever, but because they didn't feel a connection with their manager, or someone in leadership hadn't taken the time to get to know them and know their core values and know what was important to them and how they can fit into that. And, in talking to them about like, well, wait, do you meet with your manager? Like, what do you guys talk about? Their one-on-ones were, there would be an agenda. They would talk about like what they did. It was like a checklist. But there wasn't this, the ability, or there wasn't a focus on having these intentional conversations about, from a coaching and mentoring standpoint. And I think that has just been something that's broken down over time with folks across the board. In addition to that, we've implemented so many amazing tools for communication, such as Slack that I use constantly. But you get a ping on that, and your instinct is to respond right away, right? If someone sends you something through Slack. And so it's caused increased anxiety for people, and it's decreased people's processing of information and responding in a thoughtful way, right? You're just kind of firing off responses because you feel like it has to be immediate all the time. So we wanted to build an app that allows people to record what they're thinking and what they're feeling in the moment. So you could be walking your dog and having a thought about your one-on-one and how it just didn't feel good, or like your OKR and how it's not working out well, or how you just want to like thank your manager for taking the time. And so you can just pull it up on your watch or your phone or whatever and record it. And then it gets sent to the person that you're hoping receives it. And then they can listen to it on their own time. They're not being notified or pinged. There's not a red receipt. There's not all of the things that cause that anxiety. But for you, if I were to send you something, you could take some time, listen through your messages, and take the time to respond in a meaningful way in your next one-on-one. So you're connecting that or creating that connective tissue between your team, and that then creates more trust and loyalty. So our hope is that it helps increase retention within companies.
So if I'm thinking about this, because I'm always looking for what removes the friction.
Yeah.
And I just did this maybe in the last month. I said to myself, oh, this person just really gave me great service. It was just a help desk person for one of my clients. And I said, I want to recognize him in some way. Well, it sat in the file. Thankfully, I didn't forget about it.
Right.
And I did finally, 3 or 4 weeks later, put it in their kind of kudos system. But I could have easily forgotten that.
Sure.
How is what the process you guys are building, like kind of reducing the friction? Is this stuff held immediately into someone's performance appraisal, so you make sure and talk about it at your next one-on-one, or how does that work?
Yeah. So what we're trying to go is for simplicity. So if you and I work together and I wanted to, if, later on I'm doing something and I'm like, gosh, that was just such a fun experience, and I just wanted to tell Troy that was great, I can just send it to you. Again, as simple as like pulling up my watch. I don't have to like sit down and try to think of some eloquent email or whatever. It can be more intentional, right? Of just, hey, I just wanted to thank you. That was so fun. You're so great at what you do. I just wanted to let you know, and just send it to you. And so it's not held or tied to anything that is necessarily like, trackable from a performance management standpoint. But what it does is it allows you to hear it when you're ready to hear it and either respond or not, but it gives you the information that I'm hoping that you get. And if you wanted to respond, you have the time to respond to that. And you can take that information and apply it however you would like across the board, but it's more just focused on that intentional communication that right now is lacking.
That, just overall in general.
Yeah.
And I'm going to reference, so Tim Sackett was somebody who's kind of a thought leader in HR.
Yeah.
I'll shout out his podcast because he restarted it, and it's called HR Famous. But he came on the podcast, talked a little bit about this, and just in a recent episode of his podcast, he just talked about how performance management is just simply broken.
Yes.
In the United States, and probably more than the United States. And I feel like a tool like this is something that can help rebuild, because those little micro, somebody used the term, it's the moments between the moments.
Yes, that's
that
exactly
are sometimes
right.
the most important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, how often are you, not that I encourage using a phone while you're driving, but like, just out doing things like, in the grocery store, and you're just kind of thinking about the day, and you're like, oh gosh, when I get home, I need to make sure I send that note to someone to thank them or to remind them to do something, or I'm just not feeling, for me, I can tell you, Troy, that like the time where I'm thinking about stuff and stressing about stuff is oftentimes at like 2 a.m. if I sent an email or a Slack message to someone at 2 a.m, it could potentially wake them up. They could feel like they need to respond at 2 a.m, and that's not my intention. But to have something that doesn't have the notifications, that that my intention in sending it was not for you to respond right away, but just for you to have this information, removing that, decreasing that stress and anxiety. Our goal is that it's going to, again, build that trust. And then if you're able to have these conversations and you're able to peel back the layers of vulnerability and all of these things, increasing retention is important. But also, to your point, you're going to start having these more important conversations throughout the year and not just once you're at a performance review. So you have all that to build on over time, whether it's corrective or encouraging. And so when you get to performance reviews, people will have a better expectation of what's going to happen during that because you've been having really important conversations. Whereas right now, they're just not happening.
No, it's like I said, it's a huge problem. Like I said, everything I listen to and just my personal experience is it's been a train wreck.
Yeah.
Most of my career.
Yes. I know.
Well, this is excellent. So I want to have a little bit of fun with the last maybe 2 or 3 minutes we have.
Okay.
We always do something called the lightning round. I'm going to do an abbreviated lightning round.
Okay.
So the trick is I will ask the questions quickly. Your responses do not have to be quick. But let's get started with number 1.
Okay.
1.
Reading your bio, you're into music.
Yes.
What is the best concert that you've ever been to?
Pearl Jam, San Francisco, when Eddie Vedder came out before the opener and he sat on the floor and he was playing acoustic and no one realized it was him. And he started drinking red wine, sitting on the floor playing, and then he introduced the opener. He also messed up the first song, and so he went way over in time to make up for that.
About what year was this?
Oh gosh, I think it was like 16 years ago, 17 years ago, at Billy Graham.
So I saw, well, I'm going to put in quotes, saw Pearl Jam.
Okay.
Because they were opening for, I think, 2 other bands.
Okay.
I didn't know who they were, and I skipped it.
Gosh, no, you
And this would have
skipped
been like
it.
95, 96. Anyway. All right. I think
incredible.
I maybe heard one of the songs as I was coming in to the hall, as they were finishing.
Oh, man.
Bad timing.
Who are they opening
All right, we'll go back
for?
to,
I need to know.
I think it was Smashing Pumpkins and the Pixies.
Oh, what a great concert.
That was a great show. It's like for a Gen Xer, I mean, that's pretty much.
That's magic.
All right. 2. Are there any HR trends right now that you think are overhyped?
Oh, this is a loaded one, and I'm going to answer it, and it's going to sound even more loaded and hopefully not defensive. But I think what we're seeing is a lot of companies swing towards and lean on a lot of AI for employee management and communication and things like that. And we're already starting to see employees kind of push back on that a little bit because, again, if someone's having an issue with things with their manager, or like their kid is sick and they don't understand benefits and they're sent to a chatbot, it just doesn't go over well. It just makes people feel undervalued. And so I think trying to implement all of the new AI to support employees is not going to work out well in the long run.
No, I love AI and I've been using it kind of since it was released.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, before I got on the phone call, I was rebooting my NCAA March Madness AI name generator that I put together last year. But yeah, it's not good all the time.
Oh, it's not.
It actually can be a little scary if you don't put the right things around it.
Yes.
All right, and we'll do the last one.
Okay.
3.
Like I said, this is abbreviated. Best piece of advice for HR pros looking to work with startups.
Be really, really patient. I would say working with startups, and one of the reasons I love it is it's very similar. I don't know if you're a parent or been around kids, but
I am.
yeah, it's kind
Twice
of
over.
Yeah. So it's very similar sometimes to working and hanging out with like middle schoolers. It's just squirrely and weird, and you're not quite sure what's going to happen, and you have high highs and low lows. And if you deal in that space okay, then this is a good space for you. If that time, that again, the high, low lows all over the place, not quite sure what's happening, stuff is stressful or annoying or whatever, it's not going to be the best place for you. So I think in general, whether it be working with middle schoolers or working with startups, like having the most amount of patience and just deep breaths as much as possible is what I would say.
So I'm going to take a pass then on working with startups because I just had one that left middle school and I have one going in next year. So I got enough of that in my life.
Yes.
At this point.
We have one in middle school, one in high school, and 2 in college. So it's
there you go.
Understand the time.
I'm looking forward to getting one that can drive at the same time I'm not.
Yes.
I'm sure that's a whole nother set.
A whole nother thing.
Issues.
We just took 2 of our kids to Nashville because they turned 21.
Interesting.
And going out late night with your kids is another thing that's really fun. And also like, what is happening right now?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all fun.
I've got a couple of years for that. Definitely. Lisa, this was fantastic.
This was so fun.
I'll have everything in the show notes about RetainHR and 11. I certainly appreciate you being on the HRIS Careers podcast.
Yeah, this is really fun.
Any last comments?
No, just thanks so much for having me on. And if anyone has any questions or needs any help or wants to chat about HR stuff, feel free to reach out to me. I can just be reached on email at just Lisa@RetainHR.com.
Awesome. For the HRIS Careers community, we'll talk to you next time.
Here we go.